Hello everyone. In this lecture we will learn about float and clear property in CSS. Float property places an element on the left or right side of the container, allowing the text to wrap around it. Let's look at it with an example. I'm in line number 22. I'm going to create two divs, one with the image and other with the text content. Okay, here we have two divs. The first div with class name image float, this div has the image inside it, and the next div with class text content, it has some text. So let me save the file and let's go to the output. Okay, here is the output. We have two divs, right? One with the image inside it and other with some text content. Now we want to display the image on the right and the text on the left with the text wrapping around the image. That means I'll show you another page. Okay, can you see this page? This is how we want the output to be. We have image on the top and the text on the bottom. Now we want the output to be like this. We want the image on the right and the text should be wrapping around the image. How to get this effect? To get output like this, we have to use float property. We want to float the image to the right so that the text contents will wrap around the image. So let's look at how to use float property to get an output like this. Float property takes three values. So it takes values left, right and none. Float takes three values left, right, none. Let's include a float property for this div. I'm using internal CSS. I'm in line number 10. I'm going to style the img image element selector and make the image float to the right by using float property and set the value to right. Okay, so img is the element selector, right? So img, and inside I'm going to use float property and set the value to right. Save. Now let's go to the output. Okay, so now we have image on the right and text on the left, but we don't see any text wrapping around the image. So let's increase the font size of the text and line height of the text, and let's see if the text wrap around the image, if the text gets bigger. So going back to CSS, internal CSS, I'm going to make the font size to 20 pixels and I'm going to use line height property to increase the space between each line. I'm going to set it to 40 pixels and let's save this and go to the output. Oh, sorry, I've used this font size and line height property for the image, right? How it's not going to work. So this has to be given for the div. That is, this has to be given for the text content class selector. So I'm going to use text content and I'm going to use the font size and line height properties. Refresh. So now we can see the text is wrapping around the image and image is on the right. When we use float property for any element, the element will be removed from the normal page flow. So in this case we are using float property for the image and this image is removed from the normal page flow and is floating right, and the text contents are wrapping around the image. So now let's float the image to the left side of the content. I'm going to use the developer tools. Okay, here we have the image element selector and here I'm going to change float to left. See, now the image is on the left and the text is wrapping around the image. Okay, let's give margin right for the image so that we can create some space between this text and the image. Now it's better. See, now we have seen float left and right. Next value is float none. So when I use none, what happens? Float none means we are not using float. So it is displaying as before. That is, the image div is in the top and the text div is in the bottom. Okay, so float property takes three values: left, right and none. And when we use float property, that element will be removed from the normal page flow and it will either float the left or right. We look at another example using float to understand better. Let me go to Sublime Text. I am in line number 31. In this example, we will make the div elements float next to each other. So I am going to create three divs. Okay, here we have three divs with class names div1, div2 and div3. So let's style the div elements using internal style sheet. Okay, now we have styled all the three divs, div1, div2 and div3 class selectors. So we have given some background color, red, blue and green, and some padding. Okay, let's go to the output. So here we have three divs, right? This is div1, div2 and div3. So all the three divs are displaying one below another. Now to make the divs float next to each other in the same line, we have to use float property. Going back to Sublime Text. So I am going to use float right for all the three divs. Now let's check the output. See, the div elements are floating one after another in the same line. This floating behavior of elements can be used in creating navigation header, right? We will see that in the next lecture. Now let's highlight the divs. Here this is div1, div2 and div3. Because of this float property, all the divs are displayed in the same line and they are removed from the normal page flow. Okay, now let's look at clear property. Clear property is used to clear the floating behavior of elements. In our previous example, we had three div elements floating on back of each other, right? For div3 in line number 37, we have div3 and it is styled in line number 16. So for div3 element, I am going to remove float right property. Let's see what happens. Save. And going back to the output. So for div3 we have removed float right property. See, I am highlighting on div3, float property is not there. But still, why is div3 is sitting on the back of div1 and div2? Actually, to say div3 is not sitting on the back of div1 and div2. Actually, div1 and div2 are placed above div3. Okay. Let me give some opacity here for div1 and div2. So for div1 I am going to give some opacity, opacity of 0.5, and for div2 also I am going to give some opacity of 0.5. Now like what is happening actually is this div3 is covering the entire line width. But div1 and div2 are placed above div3. Div1 and div2 are sitting above div3 because div1 and div2 are floating elements. Floating elements will be removed from normal page flow, and since they are floated to right, they are sitting on top of div3. So because we have given transparency here, we can see through, right? So div2 is sitting over div3 and div1 is also sitting over div3. But now we have removed the float property for div3. But still, why div1 and div2 are sitting above div3? Why this div3 is not free? How to clear the floating property completely from div3? So for that we have to use clear property. So we have to use clear property for div3. I am going to use clear property here, clear. So this clear property takes three values: left, right and both. To clear floating left behavior, we have to use clear left. To clear floating right behavior, we have to use clear right. And to clear both left and right floating behavior, we have to use clear both. In this case, we have floating right, that is div 1 and div 2 are floating right. Correct? So we have to use clear right or clear both. So I am using clear right now. Now we can see this div 3 is completely free of this floating property and it is displaying separately in the next line. Right, so now div 3 is not floating on back of div 1 and div 2. Right, it appears in the next line following the normal flow of the document. Right, so this is how float and clear property works. In this lecture, we learnt about float and clear property in CSS. The next lecture, we will create a navigation header with logo and menu items using this float property concepts. Okay, thank you for watching.